Jimin, don't cry. If you keep crying, SUGA will never forgive himself. TAEHYUNG shouted across the silent hospital room. But it was already too late. The moment Jimin's tears hit Jungkook's blanket, SUGA's knees suddenly gave out, and he collapsed right beside the hospital bed without saying another word. Every BTS member froze. No one expected the strongest person in the room to be the first one to fall apart. Before we uncover the heartbreaking truth behind this hidden moment that was never shown to the public years ago, tell us where you're watching from in the comments, because fans from around the world are part of this story. And before we begin, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this channel so you never miss another emotional BTS drama. But the real question is this: if you had been standing in that hospital room, whose side would you have chosen? No one outside that hospital ever knew what really happened on that unforgettable night. The headlines never reported it, the cameras never captured it, and even the members agreed to bury the truth forever. Everyone believed Jungkook's condition was the biggest tragedy, but they had no idea another secret had already been destroying Jimin and SUGA long before anyone stepped into that hospital room. RM kept looking at the floor as if he already knew the ending. Jin desperately tried to keep everyone calm. Hobie silently watched every reaction, while TAEHYUNG held onto a truth that could either save the group or tear their friendship apart forever. And when Jungkook slowly opened his eyes, the very first words he whispered changed everything they thought they knew. The sound of the heart monitor echoed through the quiet hospital room, as if every single beep was counting down to something none of them were ready to face. Jungkook lay completely still beneath the white blanket, his face pale under the dim lights, while the oxygen tube resting beneath his nose reminded everyone how fragile the situation had become. Jimin stood only a few steps away, unable to move any closer. His fingers trembled as he gripped the edge of his jacket, but no amount of effort could stop the guilt from swallowing him whole. He kept replaying the same moment in his mind again and again, wondering if everything could have been different had he spoken just a few words earlier. RM remained near the window, staring out at the rainy night without saying anything. Jin quietly poured another paper cup of coffee that no one intended to drink. J-Hope walked back and forth across the room, pretending to stay busy, simply because standing still meant allowing fear to take over. TAEHYUNG leaned against the wall with his arms folded tightly across his chest, but his eyes never once left Jimin. SUGA was sitting beside Jungkook's bed, his head lowered, his hands clasped together so tightly that his knuckles had turned white. For several minutes, no one spoke. The silence was louder than any argument they had ever had. Finally, Jin cleared his throat. "The doctor said we should stay calm." His voice was gentle, but nobody answered. Jimin suddenly let out a quiet laugh that sounded completely out of place. It wasn't happiness. It was the sound of someone breaking apart from the inside. TAEHYUNG slowly looked toward him. "Why are you laughing?" Jimin rubbed both hands across his face before whispering, "Because everyone keeps saying we should stay calm, but none of you know what really happened." Every head immediately turned toward him. Even RM stepped away from the window. The room became impossibly still. J-Hope frowned. "Jimin, what are you talking about?" Jimin didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked directly at Jungkook, whose chest rose and fell with slow, mechanical rhythm. His eyes filled with tears once again. "This wasn't an accident." The sentence landed like thunder inside the room. Jin's coffee cup slipped from his hand, crashing onto the floor. RM stared at Jimin in disbelief. "Explain." His voice remained calm, but everyone knew he was barely holding himself together. Jimin slowly shook his head. "Not yet." SUGA finally lifted his face. Dark circles surrounded his exhausted eyes, making him look years older than he actually was. You don't get to hide things anymore." His voice was barely above a whisper, but the disappointment inside it cut deeper than shouting ever could. JIMIN closed his eyes. "If I tell all of you everything, someone here will never forgive me." TAEHYUNG suddenly pushed himself away from the wall. "Someone already knows, don't they?" JIMIN's silence answered the question before words ever could. RM looked around the room, trying to read everyone's expression. Jin appeared confused. J-Hope looked increasingly anxious. Taehyung's jaw tightened. Only SUGA remained strangely quiet, as though he had expected this moment for a very long time. Rain continued hitting the hospital windows. Every drop seemed heavier than the last. Then, Jungkook's fingers moved ever so slightly beneath the blanket. Everyone rushed toward the bed. "Jungkook?" Jin called softly. There was no response, only another tiny movement of his hand. The doctor had warned them that unconscious patients sometimes reacted without waking up, but hope spread through the room anyway. JIMIN instinctively stepped closer, but before he could reach the bedside, SUGA suddenly stood in front of him. "Don't!" JIMIN froze. "Hyung!" SUGA refused to move. "Not until you tell us why you said this wasn't an accident." JIMIN stared at SUGA with disbelief. "You think I hurt him?" SUGA looked away for several seconds before answering. "I don't know what to think anymore." Those words hit JIMIN harder than any accusation. For years, SUGA had always believed him first, questioned him second. Tonight, that trust had disappeared. JIMIN slowly backed away from the hospital bed. "Fine." He took a deep breath. "If that's what all of you want," his voice trembled, "then you deserve to know what happened before Jungkook collapsed." RM quietly nodded. "Start from the beginning." JIMIN looked around the room one last time. Every member was waiting. Every friendship hung by a thread. Every secret was finally demanding to be heard. He swallowed hard before speaking the words he had been terrified of saying ever since that terrible morning. 3 days ago, Jungkook asked me to keep something hidden from every single one of you. The air inside the room instantly became heavier. No one interrupted him. No one even breathed too loudly. Because deep inside, they all realized the truth they were about to hear would change the way they looked at each other forever. And none of them were prepared for the name Jungkook had whispered first when he entrusted JIMIN with that impossible secret. 3 days earlier, the atmosphere inside the BTS practice studio had seemed completely normal to everyone except Jungkook. The music was loud, the choreography was demanding, and the members joked with each other between rehearsals just like they always did. RM kept correcting formations. Jin complained that everyone was working too hard without eating. J-Hope tried to lift the mood with endless energy. Taehyung laughed at every little mistake, and SUGA quietly watched from the side while adjusting the music. To anyone looking from outside, they were simply another group preparing for another important schedule. But JIMIN couldn't stop noticing the small changes in Jungkook. Every time the practice ended, Jungkook disappeared without saying where he was going. Every time someone asked if he was tired, he smiled and insisted everything was fine. His smile looked exactly the same as always, yet somehow it never reached his eyes. At first, JIMIN convinced himself he was imagining things, but the strange feeling only grew stronger with every passing hour. During lunch, Jungkook barely touched his food. Jin immediately noticed. "You're skipping another meal?" Jungkook laughed softly. "I'm just not that hungry today." Jin frowned. "You've said that 3 days in a row." Before the conversation could continue, Jungkook stood up and excused himself, claiming he needed some fresh air. JIMIN watched him leave without another word. Something inside him refused to let it go. A few minutes later, he quietly followed. He found Jungkook alone on the rooftop of the building, standing near the edge while staring at the gray Seoul skyline. The wind carried a silence between them that felt unusually heavy. Jungkook didn't turn around when he heard the door open. "I knew you'd follow me," he said with a faint smile. JIMIN walked closer until they stood side by side. "You're hiding something." Jungkook let out a slow breath. "Am I that obvious?" "Only to me." That answer made Jungkook smile for real, but only for a second before the sadness returned. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded envelope that looked worn from being opened too many times. He held it in his hand without giving it to JIMIN. "Promise me something first." JIMIN immediately became serious. "What?" Jungkook finally looked directly into his eyes. "No matter what you read, don't tell the others." JIMIN blinked in confusion. "What is it?" Jungkook hesitated for several long seconds before placing the envelope into JIMIN's hands. "Just promise me." The weight of the paper felt strangely heavy despite being almost empty. JIMIN slowly nodded. "I promise." Jungkook lowered his head as if that answer had cost him everything. JIMIN carefully unfolded the letter. The first line immediately drained every bit of color from his face. It wasn't a fan letter. It wasn't a schedule. It wasn't a contract. It was a confidential medical report. His eyes moved across the page faster and faster as his breathing became uneven. The report listed several examinations, recommendations, and one sentence highlighted in bold that refused to leave his mind. "Further immediate evaluation is strongly recommended." JIMIN looked back at Jungkook with complete disbelief. "Why didn't you tell us?" Jungkook shrugged with a calmness that felt unnatural. "Because everyone already has enough pressure." "This isn't pressure, Jungkook. This is serious." Jungkook gently took the report back and folded it again. "Maybe, maybe not. That's why I need more tests." JIMIN grabbed his arm before he could put the envelope away. "Then we'll all go together." Jungkook immediately shook his head. "No. Why not?" "Because if they know before I'm sure, they'll stop everything." JIMIN opened his mouth to argue, but Jungkook interrupted him. "Hyung, you know they would." JIMIN couldn't deny it. RM would postpone every schedule. Jin would refuse to leave Jungkook alone. SUGA would cancel every recording session without hesitation. J-Hope would spend every hour trying to keep everyone's spirits up while silently falling apart himself. TAEHYUNG would never stop asking questions until he found every answer. The entire team would revolve around Jungkook, exactly the situation Jungkook wanted to avoid. "I just need a little time," Jungkook whispered. "Please." JIMIN stared at him, torn between keeping his promise and protecting someone he cared about like family. Finally, he nodded, though every instinct inside him screamed that it was the wrong decision. Jungkook smiled with visible relief. "Thank you." They returned to practice as if nothing had happened. No one noticed the fear hiding behind JIMIN's forced smile. No one noticed Jungkook quietly slipping the envelope back into his bag. Except there was one person standing outside the hallway, partially hidden behind the corner, who had accidentally witnessed the entire exchange from beginning to end. That person didn't hear every word, but they saw the envelope, the desperate expressions, and JIMIN's promise. And from that very moment, another secret began growing in silence, one that would soon collide with Jungkook's and push every member toward the heartbreaking night waiting inside the hospital room. The rest of that afternoon continued as though nothing unusual had happened, but for JIMIN, every minute felt painfully different. Every time the choreography stopped, he glanced toward Jungkook. Every time Jungkook smiled at the others, JIMIN wondered how much effort it took to hide whatever he was truly feeling. The medical report refused to leave his mind. He remembered every word printed on that page, especially the recommendation for immediate evaluation. The more he thought about it, the more impossible it became to believe that keeping the secret was the right decision. Meanwhile, Jungkook behaved almost perfectly normal. He laughed at Jin's jokes, practiced difficult dance moves without complaining, and even teased TAEHYUNG during a short break. Anyone watching them would have believed everything was fine. Only JIMIN noticed the tiny details everyone else missed. Jungkook occasionally pressed his fingers against the side of his ribs as if trying to ignore a sharp pain. Sometimes he paused for a split second before taking a deep breath. Once or twice, his balance shifted unexpectedly before he recovered so quickly that nobody seemed to notice. Nobody except JIMIN. Across the room, SUGA adjusted the playback system while quietly observing everyone. His expression remained unreadable, but something about JIMIN's constant attention toward Jungkook caught his eye. SUGA had known both of them for years. He could usually tell when something was wrong long before anyone spoke about it. As rehearsal finally ended, RM gathered everyone together. "Tomorrow's schedule starts early. Get some rest tonight. No staying up working, no excuses." Jin laughed. "Tell that to Yoongi." SUGA shrugged without looking up. "I'm not making promises." The group shared a brief laugh, but JIMIN barely heard it. His mind was somewhere else entirely. As everyone prepared to leave, Jungkook quietly slipped away before anyone could stop him. JIMIN instinctively followed again, but this time another voice called his name first. "JIMIN!" He turned around to find TAEHYUNG standing behind him. TAEHYUNG's smile was gone. "Can we talk?" JIMIN forced himself to stay calm. "Sure." TAEHYUNG looked around to make sure nobody else was listening. "You've been acting strange all day." "I'm just tired." TAEHYUNG slowly shook his head. "Don't lie to me." JIMIN looked away. "I'm not lying." "You are." TAEHYUNG stepped closer. "You and Jungkook were on the rooftop earlier." JIMIN's heart immediately skipped a beat. "What?" "I saw both of you come back." JIMIN remained silent. TAEHYUNG continued watching his face carefully. "Something happened up there." "Nothing important." TAEHYUNG sighed. "You know what's frustrating?" JIMIN didn't answer. "Whenever one of us starts carrying everything alone, the rest of us end up paying for it too." Those words hit closer than TAEHYUNG realized. JIMIN wanted to tell him everything. He wanted to hand over the burden he had been carrying for only a few hours because it already felt unbearable. But he remembered the promise. Jungkook hadn't asked him casually. He had trusted him completely. Breaking that trust now felt impossible. "It's not my secret," JIMIN finally whispered. TAEHYUNG immediately caught the meaning hidden inside that sentence. "So, there is a secret." JIMIN closed his eyes for a moment, realizing he had already said too much. TAEHYUNG studied him quietly before nodding once. "Fine." His voice remained calm. "I won't force you." He turned to leave, then stopped after taking only 2 steps. Without looking back, he added softly, "Just make sure whatever you're protecting doesn't end up hurting him." The hallways suddenly felt much colder. JIMIN watched TAEHYUNG disappear around the corner before rushing outside to find Jungkook. He searched the parking lot, the cafe across the street, and even the small park beside the company building. Jungkook was nowhere to be found. Several hours later, long after everyone had gone home, JIMIN's phone vibrated. The sender's name immediately made his pulse race. Jungkook. He opened the message without hesitation. "Thanks for today. Don't worry about me. I'll handle everything after tomorrow." JIMIN frowned at the screen. After tomorrow? Before he could reply, another message arrived. "And please, if anything unexpected happens, don't blame yourself." JIMIN stared at those words in complete confusion. His fingers immediately began typing. "What do you mean? Jungkook? Answer me." The message was delivered but never read. He tried calling once. No answer. twice. Still nothing. A third time. Straight to voicemail. An uneasy feeling settled deep inside his chest. It wasn't fear anymore. It was something worse. It was the terrifying instinct that someone you care about is already walking toward a disaster while you're standing too far away to stop them. At that exact moment, inside another apartment across the city, SUGA was looking at his own phone with a troubled expression. Earlier that evening, he had received an anonymous message containing only one sentence. "If you really care about Jungkook, ask JIMIN what he promised to hide." SUGA read the message again and again, unable to understand who had sent it or why. But one thing became painfully clear. Someone else knew there was a secret, and whoever that person was had just decided to drag every member into it. SUGA kept staring at the anonymous message long after the screen had gone dark. He unlocked his phone again, hoping he had misunderstood the words, but the sentence remained exactly the same. "If you really care about Jungkook, ask JIMIN what he promised to hide." There was no name attached to the number, no profile picture, no explanation, only those 13 words that immediately destroyed the peaceful evening he thought he was about to have. At first, he considered ignoring it. Anonymous messages were nothing new. As public figures, they received strange texts and rumors all the time, but something about this one felt different. It wasn't threatening, it wasn't dramatic. It sounded as though someone genuinely believed he needed to know the truth before it was too late. SUGA leaned back on the couch and replayed the entire day inside his head. He remembered JIMIN disappearing with Jungkook during lunch. He remembered how distracted JIMIN had been during rehearsal. He remembered Jungkook quietly leaving before everyone else. Suddenly, every small detail that had seemed meaningless earlier began fitting together into a pattern he didn't like at all. Without thinking any further, SUGA grabbed his keys and left his apartment. Across the city, JIMIN was still trying to call Jungkook. Every attempt ended the same way. No answer. He sent another message. "Please, tell me where you are." Nothing. 5 minutes later, he tried again. "You're making me worried." Still nothing. By midnight, JIMIN had already called more than 20 times. His apartment felt suffocatingly quiet. He couldn't sit still. He couldn't focus on anything else. Eventually, he grabbed his jacket, determined to search for Jungkook himself. The moment he opened his front door, he froze. SUGA was standing in the hallway. Neither of them spoke for several seconds. SUGA's face showed neither anger nor panic. It showed disappointment, the kind that hurt far more because it came from someone who rarely judged anyone. "Can I come in?" he asked quietly. JIMIN hesitated before stepping aside. The apartment remained silent after the door closed behind them. SUGA looked around briefly before sitting down at the dining table. JIMIN stayed standing. He already knew this conversation wouldn't end well. SUGA placed his phone on the table and turned the screen toward JIMIN. The anonymous message was still open. JIMIN read it once. His expression immediately changed. He looked away without saying anything. That single reaction answered SUGA's biggest question. The message wasn't lying. "So it's true," SUGA said softly. JIMIN remained silent. "There is something you're hiding." JIMIN slowly sat down across from him. His voice barely rose above a whisper. "I can't tell you." SUGA nodded once, almost as if he had expected that answer. "Because Jungkook asked you not to." JIMIN's eyes widened. "How did you—" "I guessed." SUGA folded his hands together. "You've never been good at hiding guilt." JIMIN let out a tired sigh. "Hyung, please don't make this harder than it already is." SUGA leaned forward. "Then help me understand." JIMIN looked down at the floor. Every promise he had made to Jungkook echoed inside his mind. "I gave him my word." SUGA remained calm. And what if keeping that word puts him in danger? Jimin's breathing became uneven. "You don't understand." "Then explain it." "I can't." "Why?" "Because if I break that promise," his voice cracked, "I'll lose his trust forever." SUGA stayed quiet for a long moment before asking the one question Jimin had been afraid of hearing all night. "Would you rather lose his trust or lose him?" The room instantly fell silent. Jimin couldn't answer. He didn't know how. Tears slowly formed in his eyes as the weight of the decision crushed him from both sides. If he stayed silent, Jungkook might be facing something dangerous completely alone. If he spoke, he would betray the one person who had trusted him enough to reveal the truth. SUGA stood up and walked toward the window. "Do you remember what we promised each other years ago?" Jimin nodded without lifting his head. Every member had once agreed that no one would ever carry a serious burden alone, no matter how difficult the truth might be. They had made that promise after surviving countless hardships together. Family before pride, trust before fear, honesty before silence. Tonight, for the first time, that promise was being tested. SUGA turned back toward Jimin. Secrets protect people until they don't. Jimin closed his eyes. His hands were shaking uncontrollably now. He wanted to speak. He wanted to tell SUGA everything about the medical report, about the rooftop conversation, about Jungkook's strange message earlier that evening. The words were already sitting on the edge of his lips. Then his phone suddenly rang. Both of them immediately looked at the screen. It wasn't Jungkook. It was an unknown number. Jimin answered without hesitation. "Hello?" For several seconds there was only silence. Then a frightened voice finally spoke. "Is this Park Jimin?" "Yes. Who is this?" The voice hesitated before answering. "I'm calling from Seoul Central Hospital." Jimin's heart stopped. SUGA's expression immediately changed the moment he heard the hospital's name. The nurse continued speaking, her voice calm but urgent. "Are you listed as Jungkook's emergency contact?" Jimin could barely breathe. "Yes." Another brief silence followed before the words he would never forget shattered his world forever. "You need to come immediately. He collapsed less than 10 minutes ago." The phone slipped from Jimin's trembling hand and landed on the floor with a dull crack that echoed through the apartment. For a brief moment, he couldn't hear anything except the sound of his own heartbeat. SUGA immediately picked up the phone and spoke to the nurse himself, asking for the hospital name, Jungkook's condition, and whether he was conscious. The answers only made the silence between them heavier. Jungkook had been brought into the emergency department by paramedics after collapsing in a parking area only a few blocks away from a private medical clinic. He had regained consciousness for only a few seconds before losing it again. The doctors were still running emergency tests, and no one could explain what had caused him to collapse so suddenly. SUGA ended the call without saying another word. Both of them looked at each other, already knowing nothing would ever be the same after tonight. They rushed out of the apartment without bothering to lock every light behind them. Rain continued pouring across the city, turning every traffic light into a blur of red and yellow reflections across the wet streets. SUGA drove faster than he ever had before, gripping the steering wheel so tightly that his hands ached. Jimin sat beside him, repeatedly calling Jungkook's phone, even though he already knew nobody would answer. Every unanswered call felt like another reminder that he had failed the promise he had made. Not the promise to keep the secret, but the unspoken promise to always protect someone he loved like a brother. Neither of them noticed that another car had quietly pulled onto the same road behind them. Inside that vehicle, RM had one hand on the steering wheel, while the other held his phone against his ear. Jin sat beside him, trying to stay calm despite the panic growing across his face. 20 minutes earlier, SUGA had sent only one short message to the group chat. "Hospital. Now." There had been no explanation, no details, just two words that instantly sent every member racing across Seoul. TAEHYUNG kept calling SUGA without getting an answer. J-Hope had already cancelled everything scheduled for the next morning before leaving his apartment. Nobody asked questions. Deep down, they already feared the answer. When JIMIN and SUGA finally reached the hospital entrance, paramedics hurried past them while nurses rushed between emergency rooms. The bright white lights made everything feel strangely unreal. JIMIN ran toward the reception desk before he had even caught his breath. John Young-kook, the receptionist immediately recognized the name. 4th floor, emergency intensive care. Neither of them waited for further instructions. They sprinted toward the elevators, but every second felt unbearably slow. The elevator doors seemed to take forever to close. The numbers climbed one floor at a time, while JIMIN silently begged for them to move faster. When the doors finally opened, they found a doctor already waiting outside the intensive care unit. His expression alone was enough to make JIMIN's stomach sink. "Are you his family?" the doctor asked. JIMIN answered without hesitation. "Yes." The doctor nodded gently. "He's stable for the moment." The word stable should have brought relief, but it didn't. The doctor's face suggested there was much more he wasn't saying. "Can we see him?" SUGA asked. "In a moment." The doctor glanced down at the chart in his hands. "First, I need to ask something." JIMIN felt another wave of dread. Has Jungkook experienced dizziness, severe fatigue, or episodes of chest discomfort recently? JIMIN froze. Images from the rehearsal flooded back into his mind. Jungkook touching his ribs, skipping meals, disappearing alone, struggling to breathe without anyone noticing. SUGA slowly turned toward JIMIN. Their eyes met for only a second, but that second was enough. SUGA realized JIMIN had seen the warning signs before anyone else. The doctor noticed the exchange immediately. "You knew something." JIMIN's lips trembled. Before he could answer, the elevator doors opened again. RM, Jin, J-Hope, and TAEHYUNG rushed into the hallway almost simultaneously. The moment they saw JIMIN's expression, every bit of hope they had carried with them disappeared. Jin walked directly to him. "Where is he?" JIMIN pointed toward the intensive care room without speaking. Through the small window in the door, they could barely make out Jungkook lying motionless beneath bright hospital lights while doctors adjusted machines surrounding his bed. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. It was the first time they had ever seen the youngest member looking so vulnerable. RM finally broke the silence. "Tell us exactly what happened." JIMIN looked around at every familiar face. They were all waiting. Every secret he had been protecting had finally reached the point where silence was no longer possible. He slowly reached into his jacket pocket and removed the folded medical report Jungkook had trusted him to hide. The paper had become wrinkled after being carried all day. His hands shook as he unfolded it. SUGA immediately recognized the document from JIMIN's expression alone. RM accepted the report first. As his eyes moved across the page, every trace of color drained from his face. Jin quietly stepped beside him to read over his shoulder. J-Hope covered his mouth in disbelief. TAEHYUNG stared at JIMIN instead of the document. He didn't need to read it. The guilt written across JIMIN's face already told him everything he needed to know. Then RM lowered the report with trembling hands and asked the one question that instantly shattered what little strength JIMIN still had left. "How long have you known?" JIMIN couldn't answer immediately. The question echoed through the hospital hallway while every pair of eyes remained fixed on him. Even the nurses passing by seemed to fade into the background as the silence grew heavier with every second. RM repeated the question, this time more quietly. "How long?" JIMIN lowered his head and whispered, 3 days. Nobody reacted at first. The words were too difficult to process. 3 days. 72 hours. Every conversation they had shared, every rehearsal they had completed, every meal they had eaten together had happened while JIMIN carried a secret that none of them knew existed. Jin slowly stepped backward until his shoulders touched the wall. He looked as though the floor beneath him had disappeared. J-Hope rubbed both hands across his face, unable to believe what he had just heard. SUGA closed his eyes for a brief moment, disappointment replacing the anger he had been trying so hard to control. TAEHYUNG never looked away from JIMIN. His expression wasn't furious, it was hurt. RM carefully folded the medical report and held it in both hands. His voice remained steady, but everyone could hear how much effort it took to stay calm. "Jungkook gave this to you?" JIMIN nodded. "He asked me to promise that I wouldn't tell anyone until he finished more tests." Jin looked at him with disbelief. "And you agreed?" JIMIN swallowed hard. "He begged me." J-Hope shook his head slowly. "You should have told us." "I know." "No," J-Hope replied, his voice cracking. "You don't know. Because if you did, we wouldn't be standing outside an intensive care unit wondering if our brother is going to wake up." The sentence hit JIMIN harder than any accusation before it. He wanted to defend himself, to explain that he had only been trying to respect Jungkook's wishes, but every explanation sounded meaningless now. The hospital doors suddenly opened and the same doctor stepped into the hallway again. Everyone immediately stood. The doctor looked at each of them before speaking. "His condition has stabilized for now, but we're still waiting for additional test results." Relief briefly washed over their faces before the doctor continued. "However, there is something unusual." RM took one step forward. "What is it?" The doctor glanced down at his notes. When he briefly regained consciousness in the ambulance, he repeated the same sentence several times. JIMIN's breathing stopped. "What did he say?" The doctor answered carefully. He kept saying, "Don't let JIMIN blame himself." The hallway fell completely silent. JIMIN felt as though the air had been knocked out of his lungs. Even now, while unconscious, Jungkook's first concern had been protecting him. Tears immediately filled JIMIN's eyes. He leaned against the wall because his legs no longer felt strong enough to hold him. SUGA quietly looked away, unable to hide the pain spreading across his own face. Jin lowered his head. RM closed his eyes. J-Hope covered his mouth. Only TAEHYUNG continued watching JIMIN. Finally, after what felt like forever, TAEHYUNG walked toward him. Everyone expected another argument. Instead, TAEHYUNG gently placed one hand on JIMIN's shoulder. "He trusted you," TAEHYUNG said softly. JIMIN nodded through tears. "I failed him." TAEHYUNG slowly shook his head. "No." JIMIN looked up in confusion. "You made the wrong choice, but you made it because you believed you were protecting him." JIMIN couldn't stop crying anymore. "That doesn't change what happened." TAEHYUNG's voice became quieter. "No, it doesn't." Before anyone could say another word, the doctor cleared his throat again. "There's one more thing." Every member turned toward him. "We found something in Jungkook's jacket pocket." The doctor reached into a transparent hospital evidence bag and removed a small sealed envelope. It looked exactly like the one JIMIN had seen on the rooftop, except this one had several words written neatly across the front in Jungkook's handwriting. The doctor read them aloud. "Only open if something happens to me." Nobody moved. The doctor continued. "It's addressed to all 6 of you." Every heartbeat in the hallway seemed to stop at once. RM accepted the envelope with both hands as though it were made of glass. None of them wanted to open it. Because if Jungkook had prepared a letter for a moment like this, then somewhere deep inside, he must have believed this night was always a possibility. RM stared at the envelope for several long seconds before carefully breaking the seal. Inside was a handwritten letter and a small flash drive wrapped together with a thin black ribbon. The first sentence on the page immediately made his hands tremble. He read it silently once, then looked up at the others with an expression none of them had ever seen before. Jin frowned. "What does it say?" RM tried to answer, but the words caught in his throat. After taking a slow breath, he finally spoke. Jungkook wrote, "If you're reading this, then the biggest secret I've ever kept from my family is finally impossible to hide." RM's hands trembled so badly that the edges of the handwritten letter shook beneath the bright hospital lights. No one urged him to read faster. No one interrupted. The hallway had become so quiet that the distant sound of medical equipment from nearby rooms seemed impossibly loud. Every member understood that whatever Jungkook had written was never meant to be read unless everything had gone terribly wrong. RM swallowed hard before continuing. "I know every one of you is probably angry with JIMIN right now." The sentence immediately made everyone look toward JIMIN again. Tears continued rolling down his face as he stood frozen beside the wall. RM continued reading. "Please don't blame him. I forced him to promise. I knew he would choose my trust over his own peace of mind, because that's the kind of person Park Jimin has always been." Jimin covered his face with both hands. Hearing Jungkook defend him even now felt almost unbearable. Jin quietly lowered his head while J-Hope wiped away tears he had been trying unsuccessfully to hide. SUGA stared at the floor, saying nothing. RM continued. "If anyone should be blamed, it should be me. I decided that carrying this alone was easier than watching all of you suffer before there was anything certain to tell." TAEHYUNG slowly exhaled, his shoulders dropping as though a weight had shifted, though not disappeared. The letter continued. "For months I've been pretending that everything was normal because I couldn't stand the thought of becoming another burden. Every time one of you smiled, I convinced myself I could hide the truth for one more day." RM paused again. His voice had become noticeably weaker. "Months?" Jin whispered in disbelief. He said, "Months." The realization spread through the group like another shockwave. This hadn't begun 3 days ago. The medical report Jimin had seen was only the latest piece of a much longer story. Jungkook had been struggling in silence for far longer than anyone had imagined. RM looked back at the page. "I skipped meals because I didn't want anyone asking questions. I left rehearsals early because I had appointments I couldn't explain. I laughed louder because I hoped nobody would notice how exhausted I really was." Every memory suddenly changed meaning. Jin remembered constantly telling Jungkook to eat more. J-Hope remembered asking why he seemed tired after short rehearsals. SUGA remembered catching him rubbing his chest late at night in the studio before quickly pretending nothing was wrong. RM remembered several meetings Jungkook had quietly missed without giving detailed explanations. None of them had connected the pieces. None of them had looked deeply enough. JIMIN slowly sank into one of the waiting chairs, unable to remain standing any longer. His promise suddenly felt even heavier because he now understood just how long Jungkook had been protecting all of them instead of asking for help. RM reached the next paragraph.
"There is one thing none of you know. Even JIMIN doesn't know this part." Every member immediately looked up. JIMIN lifted his head in surprise. RM frowned as he continued reading silently before his expression changed
Completely. His eyes widened. His breathing became uneven. The paper shook violently in his hands. "RM?" Jin asked cautiously. "What is it?" RM didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reread the paragraph as if hoping he had misunderstood it. Finally, he looked at SUGA. "Yoongi," his voice cracked. "You need to hear this yourself." SUGA slowly accepted the letter. The hallway remained silent as his eyes moved across the handwritten lines. Within seconds, all the color disappeared from his face. His lips parted slightly, but no words came out. The letter slipped from his fingers before he managed to catch it again. J-Hope immediately stepped closer. "Hyung." SUGA closed his eyes. For the first time since arriving at the hospital, his composure completely disappeared. He whispered only one sentence. "No, he shouldn't have done that." Everyone stared at him in confusion. TAEHYUNG stepped forward. "Done what?" SUGA looked toward the intensive care room where Jungkook still lay unconscious. Tears slowly gathered in his eyes before he finally spoke. He canceled his own treatment. Nobody understood.
JIMIN stood up immediately. "What are you talking about?" SUGA looked back at the letter, struggling to continue. "He wrote that several weeks ago. He postponed an important medical examination because I was working through severe exhaustion in the studio. He knew I wouldn't stop unless someone stayed with me. Instead of going to his own appointment, he stayed all night helping me finish the album." The hallway fell into stunned silence. SUGA's voice became quieter with every word. "He wrote that he kept telling himself he could reschedule later." Jimin's breathing became ragged. Jin covered his mouth. RM slowly closed his eyes. J-Hope leaned against the wall for support. TAEHYUNG stared at the floor in complete disbelief. SUGA looked broken. "If he had gone that day—" He couldn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. Everyone already understood. The possibility that an earlier examination might have changed everything instantly filled the hallway with unbearable guilt. SUGA tightened his grip on the letter until the paper crumpled slightly in his hands. "He protected me," he whispered, "and I never even knew." Before anyone could respond, the intensive care monitor inside Jungkook's room suddenly began sounding a sharp warning alarm. Every doctor and nurse rushed toward the room at once. The doors slammed shut in front of the members before any of them could see what was happening inside, leaving all 6 of them staring helplessly through the small glass window as medical staff surrounded Jungkook's bed with frightening urgency. The piercing alarm from inside the intensive care room shattered every remaining ounce of composure the members had been desperately holding on to. Doctors rushed from every direction, while nurses pushed emergency equipment through the doors with practiced urgency. The automatic doors locked immediately behind them, leaving the 6 members standing helplessly in the hallway. JIMIN instinctively stepped toward the glass, his hands pressing against the cold window as he tried to see past the moving figures surrounding Jungkook's bed. He couldn't make out much. Only flashes of white coats, bright overhead lights, and the frantic movements of the medical team. Every second stretched into what felt like an hour. Nobody spoke. Nobody dared to imagine what was happening on the other side of that door. Jin quietly began whispering a prayer beneath his breath. J-Hope paced back and forth without realizing he was doing it, stopping only when he reached the end of the hallway before turning around again. RM remained completely still, his eyes fixed on the room, trying to stay calm for everyone else, even though his own heart was pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. TAEHYUNG folded his arms tightly across his chest, but the slight tremble in his fingers betrayed the fear he refused to show. SUGA still held Jungkook's letter in one hand, staring at the final paragraph he had not yet read, unable to bring himself to continue. JIMIN never took his eyes off the room. Every memory flooded his mind all at once. Their first practice together. Endless late-night rehearsals. Long conversations after concerts. Jungkook laughing until he could barely breathe. Jungkook quietly encouraging everyone else before thinking about himself. Jungkook apologizing for things that had never been his fault. The thought that those memories might become all he had left made his chest tighten until it hurt to breathe. Nearly 15 agonizing minutes passed before the emergency alarm finally stopped. The silence that followed somehow felt even more terrifying. One by one, the doctors inside stepped away from the bed.
The members tried desperately to read their expressions through the glass, but the distance made it impossible. Finally, the intensive care doors opened. The lead physician slowly walked into the hallway, removing his gloves as he approached. Every member stood immediately. Nobody asked the question out loud because they were afraid of the answer. The doctor looked exhausted. He glanced at each of them before speaking carefully. We managed to stabilize him again. 6 quiet sighs of relief escaped almost simultaneously. Some of the unbearable pressure inside the hallway eased, but only slightly. The doctor continued before anyone could celebrate. However, this episode confirms that what we're dealing with is more serious than we initially believed. RM stepped forward. Can you tell us exactly what's happening? The doctor hesitated for a moment. Not until we receive the remaining laboratory results. JIMIN clenched his fists. How long? Several more hours. The waiting suddenly felt impossible. Jin rubbed both hands across his tired face. Can one of us stay with him? The doctor nodded. Only one person at a time. Before anyone could volunteer, the doctor added something unexpected. Actually, Jungkook made that decision himself before he lost consciousness. Every member looked at him in confusion. He specifically requested someone. Jimin's heartbeat immediately quickened. The doctor checked the chart once more. He asked for TAEHYUNG. The hallway became completely silent again. TAEHYUNG looked just as surprised as everyone else. Me? The doctor nodded. Those were among the last clear words he spoke before he lost consciousness again. JIMIN frowned in confusion. SUGA slowly lifted his head. JIMIN frowned in confusion. SUGA slowly lifted his head. RM looked toward TAEHYUNG, trying to understand why Jungkook would ask for him instead of JIMIN, who had been protecting his secret, or Jin, who always took care of everyone, or RM as their leader. Even TAEHYUNG himself seemed unable to explain it. There has to be a mistake, TAEHYUNG whispered. The doctor calmly shook his head. There wasn't. After a brief pause, he added, He repeated your name twice. TAEHYUNG looked toward the hospital room, his thoughts racing. Suddenly, he remembered something Jungkook had said nearly 2 weeks earlier, after everyone else had left the studio. At the time, it had seemed like an ordinary conversation. Now, for the first time, it returned with frightening clarity. Jungkook had smiled quietly before saying, If anything unexpected ever happens to me, promise you won't let everyone hate each other. TAEHYUNG had laughed, assuming Jungkook was simply exhausted from another long rehearsal. Nothing's going to happen. Jungkook had looked away toward the empty practice room mirror. Just promise me. Without thinking much about it, TAEHYUNG had agreed. Standing outside the intensive care room now, that forgotten conversation suddenly felt terrifying. Jungkook hadn't been speaking hypothetically. He had been preparing him. TAEHYUNG slowly looked back at the others. Their exhausted faces reflected fear, guilt, confusion, and heartbreak all at once. Then he understood why Jungkook had called his name. It wasn't because TAEHYUNG knew the secret. It was because Jungkook had trusted him with something even more important than the truth itself. He had trusted him to keep the family together after everything fell apart. TAEHYUNG quietly followed the doctor toward the intensive care room. But just before the doors closed behind him, he turned back toward the other members. His eyes settled on JIMIN first, then SUGA, then RM, Jin, and J-Hope. His voice remained calm despite the tears gathering in his eyes. Whatever happens after tonight, don't let his biggest fear come true. The doors closed, leaving the remaining 5 members alone in the silent hallway, unaware that inside Jungkook's bedside drawer lay another sealed envelope addressed only to TAEHYUNG, one containing a confession so devastating that it would force every member to question everything they believed about the night Jungkook collapsed.
TAEHYUNG followed the doctor through the intensive care doors with slow, uncertain steps. The moment the doors closed behind him, the noise from the hallway disappeared, replaced by the steady rhythm of heart monitors and the quiet voices of nurses moving carefully between patients. The room felt colder than before. Jungkook remained unconscious, surrounded by machines that now seemed less like medical equipment and more like silent reminders of how close they had come to losing him. TAEHYUNG stopped beside the bed without saying anything. For several long seconds, he simply looked at Jungkook's face. It was difficult to believe this was the same person who had been laughing in the practice room only days earlier. The doctor quietly approached the bedside table and opened the top drawer. Without saying a word, he removed a sealed white envelope with TAEHYUNG's name written neatly across the front in Jungkook's familiar handwriting. "He asked us to give you this only if his condition became unstable," the doctor explained softly. He was very specific. TAEHYUNG accepted the envelope with trembling hands. It felt surprisingly heavy, as though the paper inside carried far more than words. The doctor gently placed one hand on his shoulder before leaving the room to give him privacy. Now only TAEHYUNG and Jungkook remained. TAEHYUNG looked at the envelope for several moments before finally breaking the seal. Inside he found 3 folded pages and a small silver key attached to a faded blue keychain. His eyebrows tightened in confusion. He immediately recognized the keychain. Years ago, all 7 members had bought matching keychains during a trip together, but Jungkook's had disappeared shortly afterward. Nobody had ever found it. TAEHYUNG unfolded the first page and began reading. "TAEHYUNG, if you're holding this, then things have become much worse than I hoped they would. Sorry for asking you to carry another burden." TAEHYUNG quietly sat beside the bed without taking his eyes off the letter. "You once asked me why I always seemed calmer whenever you were around. I never answered honestly. The truth is, you notice things that everyone else misses, even when you pretend not to." TAEHYUNG remembered that conversation immediately. It had happened late one night after rehearsal. He had assumed Jungkook was simply avoiding the question. He continued reading. "That's why I'm trusting you with something I couldn't tell anyone else. Not even JIMIN." TAEHYUNG slowly looked toward Jungkook before lowering his eyes back to the page. "Everything everyone believes about my condition is incomplete. The medical report JIMIN saw wasn't the beginning. It wasn't even the worst part." TAEHYUNG's breathing became slower. "Several months ago, I received another result that I never showed anyone." His hands immediately tightened around the paper. "I asked for a second opinion because I hoped the first doctors were wrong. I kept delaying the truth because I thought there would always be another tomorrow." TAEHYUNG closed his eyes briefly. His heart sank with every sentence. "But there's something even more important than my health. Someone has been making sure I stayed silent." TAEHYUNG suddenly opened his eyes. He reread that sentence twice to make sure he hadn't misunderstood it. "Someone." His heartbeat accelerated. He quickly continued reading. "Before you panic, no, this isn't about a stranger. It's someone close enough to know my schedule, my appointments, and every conversation I've tried to keep private." TAEHYUNG immediately looked toward the hospital door. His mind raced through every possibility. It couldn't be. There was no way. Yet Jungkook's own handwriting left no room for misunderstanding. Someone close to all of them had known far more than they should have. The second page began with another sentence that made TAEHYUNG's blood run cold. "The anonymous messages didn't begin tonight." He stared at the words in disbelief. "Anonymous messages?" Jungkook continued. "For nearly 6 weeks, I've been receiving messages telling me not to tell the others about my medical appointments. At first I thought they were cruel jokes. Then the messages began mentioning places I had visited that no one else knew about." TAEHYUNG's breathing became uneven. Remembered SUGA receiving an anonymous message only hours earlier. Suddenly, that message no longer seemed like an isolated incident. "I deleted most of them because I didn't want anyone worrying, but I saved the last one." TAEHYUNG turned the page over. Taped neatly to the back was a printed screenshot of a text message. The sender's number had no name. The message contained only one sentence. "If your family finds out the truth before you're ready, someone you love will regret it forever." TAEHYUNG felt an icy chill move through his entire body. This wasn't random harassment anymore. Whoever had been sending these messages knew exactly how to manipulate Jungkook. They understood his greatest weakness wasn't fear for himself. It was fear of hurting the people he loved. TAEHYUNG looked toward the unconscious Jungkook again. "Why didn't you tell us?" he whispered. There was no answer except the quiet beeping of the heart monitor. He turned to the final page. The first sentence made him stop breathing altogether. I think I know who's sending the messages, but if I'm right, exposing the truth could destroy BTS long before my illness ever does. Taehyung read the final sentence over and over, unable to accept what was written in front of him. His hands slowly began to shake as countless memories rushed through his mind. Someone inside their circle, someone who knew Jungkook's appointments, his private schedule, and even the conversations he believed only he and Jimin had shared. The possibility felt impossible, yet Jungkook had never been the type to make accusations without a reason. Taehyung lowered the letter and looked at Jungkook's peaceful face. Who were you talking about? He whispered, hoping for an answer that would never come. His eyes drifted back to the paper. Beneath the final paragraph, Jungkook had written one last instruction in smaller handwriting. Don't tell the others until you see what's inside my studio locker. Taehyung frowned. Studio locker? He immediately looked at the small silver key resting in his palm. The faded blue keychain suddenly made sense. It wasn't a random keepsake. It was the key to something Jungkook had hidden away long before tonight. Taehyung quietly slipped the key into his pocket just as the doctor re-entered the room. Your time is almost up, the doctor said gently. Taehyung folded the letter and carefully placed it inside his jacket. Before leaving, he looked at Jungkook one last time. I don't know what you're trying to protect, he whispered softly, but I promise I'll find the truth. Outside in the hallway, the remaining members immediately stood the moment Taehyung stepped through the doors. Jimin rushed toward him first. Did he wake up? Taehyung slowly shook his head. No. RM noticed something different in Taehyung's expression almost instantly. What happened in there? Taehyung hesitated. The letter felt unbearably heavy inside his pocket. Jungkook had trusted him with something that could change everything, yet he had also asked him to wait. For the second time in less than a week, another member now carried a secret that couldn't easily be shared. Taehyung forced himself to remain calm. He left another letter. Every face immediately changed. SUGA looked up. Jin stepped closer. J-Hope frowned. Jimin's heart sank. RM quietly asked, what did it say? Taehyung chose his words carefully. Mostly, he apologized. It wasn't a complete lie, but it certainly wasn't the whole truth. Jimin searched Taehyung's face. They had known each other for too many years. He could tell Taehyung was hiding something. Before he could ask another question, a nurse approached the group carrying a transparent plastic bag filled with Jungkook's personal belongings. These were in his pockets when he arrived. She handed the bag to RM before walking away. Inside were Jungkook's phone, wallet, watch, a few folded receipts, and a small black notebook with worn edges. Jin immediately noticed it. I've never seen that notebook before. RM carefully removed it from the bag. The cover contained no title, only Jungkook's initials written neatly in one corner. He slowly opened the first page. Instead of diary entries, every page contained dates, times, and short handwritten notes. March 7th, followed after clinic appointment. March 15th, same black vehicle outside company. April 2nd, someone entered practice room after midnight. The members looked at one another in stunned silence. Jungkook hadn't imagined being watched. He had been documenting it for months. J-Hope flipped to another page. April 18th, anonymous message again, deleted. SUGA frowned deeply. He never told us any of this. RM continued turning the pages until something slipped out from between them. A folded photograph landed on the floor. Taehyung bent down and picked it up. The moment he looked at the picture, his expression changed completely. Jimin immediately noticed. What is it? Taehyung didn't answer. Everyone gathered around him. It was a blurry photograph taken from a distance outside the company building late at night. Jungkook stood near the entrance speaking to someone wearing a dark hooded jacket. The face was impossible to recognize, but one detail immediately caught everyone's attention. The mysterious figure was wearing a silver bracelet identical to one owned by a BTS member. Jin looked closer. Wait, SUGA leaned in beside him. That bracelet. RM slowly raised his eyes toward the others. Every member knew the bracelet. It had been a limited gift exchanged between them years earlier. Only 7 identical bracelets had ever existed, one for each member. The problem was that the hooded figure's face remained hidden, making it impossible to identify who it actually was. Jimin quietly shook his head. Someone could have borrowed it. Taehyung remained unusually silent. Inside his pocket, Jungkook's letter seemed to grow heavier with every passing second. He now knew something the others didn't. Jungkook believed he already suspected who had been sending the messages. If Taehyung revealed that now, every relationship inside the group could collapse before they even knew the full truth. RM carefully placed the photograph back inside the notebook. We're not accusing anyone. His voice was firm. Not until we have facts. Everyone nodded, though the uneasiness remained. At that exact moment, none of them noticed a man standing quietly at the far end of the hospital corridor, partially hidden behind a vending machine. He wore a baseball cap pulled low over his face and appeared to be looking down at his phone. After watching the members for several minutes, he typed a short message and pressed send. Seconds later, TAEHYUNG's phone vibrated inside his pocket. He pulled it out without thinking. The message came from an unknown number. There were only 8 words on the screen. Don't open the studio locker unless you're alone. TAEHYUNG stared at the message until the words began to blur. Don't open the studio locker unless you're alone. His heartbeat became painfully loud inside his ears. The timing was impossible to ignore. Only minutes earlier, he had read Jungkook's letter mentioning the studio locker, and now an anonymous sender somehow knew exactly what Jungkook had asked him to do. TAEHYUNG instinctively looked around the hallway. Doctors, nurses, visitors, and patients moved through the corridor as if nothing unusual had happened, yet he suddenly felt as though every stranger could be watching him. Before anyone else noticed the message, he quietly locked his phone and slipped it back into his pocket. JIMIN immediately caught the movement. Everything okay? TAEHYUNG forced a small nod. Just another schedule notification. The lie came more naturally than he expected, and that frightened him even more. Only hours earlier he had silently judged JIMIN for carrying a secret. Now he was doing exactly the same thing. RM suggested everyone sit down while they waited for more news from the doctors. Exhaustion had begun showing on every face. Jin bought bottles of water that nobody really drank. J-Hope leaned back in one of the waiting chairs, staring at the ceiling without seeing it. SUGA remained quietly reading Jungkook's handwritten letter again and again, as though hoping the words would somehow change. JIMIN sat closest to the intensive care doors, never taking his eyes away from the small window leading into Jungkook's room. TAEHYUNG sat slightly apart from the others, his thoughts racing faster with every passing minute. The studio locker, the anonymous message, the hidden key, the photograph, none of it felt random anymore. It felt planned. After nearly half an hour of silence, RM's phone rang. It was the company manager. RM stepped away to answer, speaking quietly near the window. The remaining members barely listened until RM suddenly frowned. What do you mean someone was already there? The others immediately looked toward him. RM listened for another few moments before ending the call. There's a problem. Jin stood first. What happened? RM looked around at everyone before answering. Security reported that someone entered the practice building less than an hour after Jungkook was brought here. TAEHYUNG felt the blood drain from his face. RM continued. They didn't steal any equipment. They went directly to the members' floor, stayed only a few minutes, then disappeared before security reached them. SUGA immediately asked, did they identify the person? RM slowly shook his head. The security cameras on that hallway stopped recording for exactly 6 minutes. J-Hope stared in disbelief. You're saying someone disabled the cameras? RM nodded. Only on that floor. TAEHYUNG's hand instinctively moved toward the key inside his pocket. 6 minutes, long enough to reach Jungkook's locker, long enough to remove something, or long enough to realize it was still locked. JIMIN noticed TAEHYUNG's unusual expression again. What's wrong? TAEHYUNG hesitated before answering. Nothing. This time JIMIN didn't believe him at all. Before the conversation could continue, SUGA quietly stood up. I'm going to the company. RM looked surprised. Now. If someone broke into the members' floor tonight, I'm not waiting until morning. RM considered the idea for a moment before nodding. I'll come with you. TAEHYUNG immediately interrupted. I'll go too. Every eye turned toward him. RM frowned. You should stay here. I need to see something. His answer came too quickly. SUGA studied him carefully. Something Jungkook told you? TAEHYUNG froze. For a second nobody spoke. Then he slowly nodded. I can't explain yet. JIMIN looked down at the floor. The irony wasn't lost on him. Hours ago he had been the one asking everyone to trust him without explanations. Now TAEHYUNG was standing in exactly the same position. RM let out a slow breath. Fine, the 3 of us will go. Jin Hobei, stay with JIMIN. SUGA looked toward JIMIN before leaving. If Jungkook wakes up, call immediately. JIMIN nodded. I will. Less than 20 minutes later, RM, SUGA, and TAEHYUNG arrived at the nearly empty company building. The lobby lights were dimmed, and the usually busy hallways were completely silent. A security officer met them near the entrance and explained that no signs of forced entry had been found. Whoever entered the building had apparently known exactly how to avoid suspicion. They rode the elevator to the practice floor without speaking. When the doors opened, an uncomfortable silence greeted them. Everything looked normal. Dance studio stood empty. Hallway lights remained on. Nothing appeared disturbed, yet all three of them felt that someone had been there only a short time earlier. TAEHYUNG walked directly toward the row of personal lockers near the rehearsal room. His eyes immediately found Jungkook's locker. For one terrifying second, he thought it had already been opened. The lock hung exactly where it always had, untouched. He quietly removed the small silver key from his pocket. RM watched him closely. That key was in the letter. TAEHYUNG nodded. SUGA folded his arms. Whatever's inside, we're finding out together. TAEHYUNG slowly inserted the key into the lock. His hand trembled as he turned it. A soft click echoed through the silent hallway. He carefully pulled the locker door open. Inside were neatly folded practice clothes, a water bottle, several notebooks, and a plain brown storage box pushed toward the back. Across the top of the box, written in Jungkook's unmistakable handwriting, were 6 words that instantly made all three of them stop breathing. Open only after checking the mirror. RM, SUGA, and TAEHYUNG stared at the handwritten instruction without moving. Open only after checking the mirror. None of them immediately understood what Jungkook meant. TAEHYUNG carefully set the brown storage box back inside the locker without touching the lid. RM slowly looked around the empty practice hallway. What mirror? SUGA frowned. There are mirrors in every practice room. TAEHYUNG remembered something from Jungkook's letter. Jungkook had written that someone had entered the practice room after midnight several months earlier. If he had left another clue, it was probably somewhere only the members would recognize. The three of them walked into the largest rehearsal studio. The room was completely dark, except for the emergency lights glowing faintly near the exits. RM switched on the overhead lights. The enormous wall-length mirror reflected the empty studio back at them. At first glance, everything looked perfectly ordinary. TAEHYUNG slowly approached the mirror, scanning every corner with careful attention. He ran his eyes across the glass from left to right, looking for scratches, tape, fingerprints, or anything unusual. Nothing. SUGA examined the edges of the mirror while RM checked the floor beneath it. Several minutes passed without anyone speaking. Finally, RM sighed. Maybe he meant something symbolic. TAEHYUNG shook his head. No. He continued studying the reflection, then something caught his attention. Near the lower right corner of the mirror, almost invisible unless the light struck it at a certain angle, was a tiny circular smudge no larger than a coin. He crouched down. "Hyung, come here." RM and SUGA immediately joined him. TAEHYUNG gently touched the edge of the mark. It wasn't dirt, it was transparent tape. Carefully peeling it away, he uncovered a small folded piece of paper hidden behind the mirror frame. SUGA slowly let out a breath. He really left us clues. TAEHYUNG unfolded the note. There were only 2 handwritten lines. If the locker is still locked, then you arrived before they did. If it's already open, don't trust what you find inside. A heavy silence filled the room. RM reread the message several times. The same word again. Jungkook hadn't believed he was dealing with only one person. SUGA looked toward the hallway outside the practice room. Someone expected this locker to be opened. TAEHYUNG immediately remembered the anonymous text message telling him not to open it unless he was alone. Whoever had sent it clearly knew exactly where he was supposed to go. RM folded the note and placed it inside his pocket. "Let's open the box." They returned to the locker. TAEHYUNG slowly lifted the lid of the brown storage box. Inside were several folders arranged neatly, a portable hard drive, another notebook, and dozens of printed screenshots organized by date. The top folder contained copies of anonymous messages Jungkook had received over several months. Some were simple warnings. Others were far more disturbing. "Stop asking questions. Your family doesn't need another problem. You already know what happens if people ignore advice." SUGA clenched his jaw. Whoever did this knew exactly how to manipulate him. RM picked up another folder. It contained appointment confirmations, cancelled consultations, and handwritten notes tracking every medical visit Jungkook had secretly attended. Each cancellation had a short explanation written beside it. Stayed for rehearsal, helped finish recording, didn't want members to worry. JIMIN's name appeared several times, always beside notes reminding himself not to break the promise he had demanded. SUGA quietly looked away. Every page only increased the guilt he already carried. Then TAEHYUNG reached the bottom of the box. Beneath everything else lay a small black envelope sealed with clear tape. Across the front, Jungkook had written, "Only if you still don't believe me." RM carefully opened it. Inside was a single USB flash drive and one printed photograph. The moment he looked at the picture, his expression froze. SUGA immediately took it from him. His breathing stopped. TAEHYUNG leaned closer. It was a high-resolution image taken inside the company building late at night. Jungkook stood alone near the rehearsal hallway, unaware that someone was photographing him from behind a corner. But the shocking part wasn't Jungkook. Reflected in the glass beside him was the faint image of another person secretly watching him. Unlike the previous blurry photograph, this reflection was much clearer. The face was still partially hidden, but one feature stood out unmistakably. The person was wearing the exact same baseball cap as the man TAEHYUNG had noticed standing silently at the far end of the hospital corridor only a few hours earlier. TAEHYUNG's eyes widened. "I've seen him." RM immediately turned toward him. "Where?" "At the hospital." SUGA looked at him in disbelief. "You're sure?" TAEHYUNG nodded without hesitation. He was watching all of us. Before anyone could respond, the lights inside the practice room suddenly went out. The entire floor was plunged into darkness. For one long second, nobody moved. Then the emergency lights flickered on, casting dim red illumination across the hallway. At the exact same moment, the sound of footsteps echoed from somewhere outside the studio. Slow, deliberate, getting closer with every second. RM quietly whispered, "Someone else is still in this building." The footsteps echoed through the dark hallway with slow, deliberate rhythm, stopping every few seconds, as though whoever was outside wanted them to know they were not alone. None of the three members spoke. RM instinctively stepped in front of TAEHYUNG and SUGA, his eyes fixed on the practice room entrance, while the emergency lights bathed the floor in a dim red glow. SUGA quietly reached for the nearest metal practice chair, gripping it firmly without making a sound. TAEHYUNG slipped Jungkook's photograph and the USB drive into his jacket before carefully closing the storage box. His heartbeat pounded so loudly that he could barely hear anything else. Another step, then another. The sound was now directly outside the studio. RM slowly moved toward the light switch, pressing it repeatedly. Nothing happened. The power on the entire floor appeared to have failed. The emergency lights continued flickering weakly, creating shifting shadows across the mirrors lining the room. SUGA whispered, "Stay together." None of them argued. The footsteps stopped completely. An uncomfortable silence settled over the hallway. TAEHYUNG frowned. Why did they stop? Before anyone answered, a soft metallic sound came from just beyond the practice room door, followed by the unmistakable click of someone trying the handle. The door moved slightly but didn't open because TAEHYUNG had unconsciously locked it from the inside earlier. Whoever stood outside slowly turned the handle again, this time more forcefully. RM motioned for complete silence. They stood absolutely still, barely breathing. After several tense seconds, the handle stopped moving. A shadow appeared beneath the narrow gap at the bottom of the door. Someone was standing there without making a sound. 1 minute passed, then another. Nobody inside the room dared to move. Finally, the shadow disappeared. The footsteps resumed, gradually growing fainter until they vanished somewhere deeper inside the building. SUGA waited another full minute before quietly approaching the door. He pressed his ear against it, listening carefully. Nothing. He unlocked the door as slowly as possible and looked into the hallway. It was empty. RM stepped out beside him, scanning both directions. Every corridor stood deserted. No movement. No voices. Only the faint hum of emergency lighting. TAEHYUNG noticed something lying on the floor directly in front of the practice room entrance. A white envelope. It hadn't been there earlier. He carefully picked it up. There was no name written on the front. Only one sentence printed in black letters. "You opened the wrong box first." The three members stared at the envelope in stunned silence. RM immediately looked back toward Jungkook's locker. "Wrong box," TAEHYUNG frowned. "There was only one." SUGA shook his head. "No." He pointed toward the bottom compartment beneath the main locker shelf, one they had barely noticed because it blended perfectly into the cabinet. Hidden near the floor was another small locked compartment. TAEHYUNG's pulse quickened. They had completely missed it. Jungkook's note had warned them not to trust what they found if the locker had already been opened, but they had assumed the main compartment was everything. RM slowly knelt beside the hidden compartment. There was another keyhole, smaller than the first. TAEHYUNG searched inside the brown storage box again. Taped beneath the lid, almost invisible, was a tiny second key. "He knew we'd miss it," TAEHYUNG whispered. SUGA nodded quietly. He wanted to make sure only someone paying attention would find this. Taehyung inserted the second key into the hidden lock. Another soft click echoed through the silent hallway. As the compartment opened, all three of them immediately realized why Jungkook had hidden it so carefully. Inside was a slim laptop, several encrypted external drives, and one thick notebook labeled only with a date from nearly 7 months earlier. RM opened the notebook first. Every page contained detailed observations written in Jungkook's handwriting. Dates, locations, names of cafes, parking garages, clinic entrances, vehicle license plate fragments. Descriptions of strangers who appeared repeatedly near places Jungkook visited. It wasn't a diary, it was an investigation. Jungkook hadn't simply been documenting his own illness, he had been trying to identify someone following him. SUGA picked up the laptop. A password screen immediately appeared. Beneath it was a small handwritten sticky note attached to the keyboard. Password, the place we became 7. RM smiled sadly despite the tension. Our debut date? Taehyung shook his head. No, he wrote place, not day. SUGA thought quietly for several seconds before his eyes widened. The old practice room. RM immediately entered the name of the tiny basement practice studio where all 7 members had once trained together before debut. The laptop unlocked instantly. A folder appeared automatically on the desktop. Its title consisted of only 3 words. If I'm wrong. RM clicked it open. Inside were dozens of video files recorded over several months. Most were security camera clips copied from different locations. Others appeared to be recordings Jungkook had secretly made with his own phone. The earliest video showed Jungkook leaving a medical clinic alone. A man wearing a baseball cap appeared several seconds later, following him at a careful distance. Another video showed the same man outside the company building. Another showed him sitting inside a cafe across the street from the practice studio. The same person, the same cap, the same careful distance. Taehyung felt a chill run down his spine. He knew that face. He had seen that exact figure standing silently in the hospital corridor. Then RM opened the newest video, the one recorded only 3 nights before Jungkook collapsed. The recording lasted less than 30 seconds. Jungkook's voice could be heard whispering from behind the camera. If you're seeing this, he finally realized, I know he's been following me. Suddenly, the man in the baseball cap stopped walking, turned directly toward the hidden camera, and slowly smiled before looking straight into the lens, as if he had known all along that Jungkook was recording him. For several long seconds, nobody inside the practice room moved. The frozen image of the man smiling directly into Jungkook's hidden camera remained on the laptop screen, making the room feel even colder than before. It wasn't the smile of someone who had been caught. It was the smile of someone who had expected to be watched all along. RM slowly paused the video and leaned closer to the screen. The image quality was far better than anything they had seen before, but the baseball cap still cast enough shadow over the man's face to hide most of his features. Only the lower half of his face remained visible. SUGA quietly adjusted the brightness, hoping to reveal more details, but the picture only became grainier. Taehyung stared at the man's posture instead of his face. Something about the way he stood felt strangely familiar. He had seen that body language somewhere before, yet no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't remember where. RM continued searching through the folder. Several documents appeared alongside the videos. One file was titled Timeline. Another was labeled Do Not Ignore. RM opened the second one first. It contained a typed list of dates matching the anonymous messages Jungkook had received. Next to each message was another column listing unusual events that happened shortly afterward. Appointment cancellations, unexpected schedule changes, security camera failures, anonymous phone calls. The pattern was impossible to dismiss as coincidence. Whoever had been sending the messages seemed to know Jungkook's plans before they happened. SUGA folded his arms tightly. This wasn't random. RM nodded slowly. Someone had access to information that should have been private. Taehyung remained focused on the paused video. The man's left wrist briefly became visible as he turned toward the camera. There was no silver bracelet this time. Instead, he wore a black leather watch with a deep scratch across the strap. Taehyung suddenly remembered seeing that exact watch somewhere recently, but before the memory became clear, his phone vibrated again. Another message from the same unknown number. He hesitated before opening it. You're wasting time. The hospital is where the real story begins. His heart skipped a beat. The sender knew they had left the hospital. Worse, they knew they were inside the practice building. TAEHYUNG immediately showed the message to RM and SUGA. RM's expression hardened. How could they possibly know where we are? SUGA looked toward the dark hallway outside the practice room. Unless, none of them finished the sentence. They all reached the same conclusion at the same time. Either someone had followed them from the hospital or someone was watching the building right now. RM immediately closed the laptop. We are leaving. TAEHYUNG quickly collected Jungkook's notebook, the hard drives, the photographs, and the USB stick before locking everything back inside his backpack. SUGA carefully erased any obvious signs that they had opened the hidden compartment. Minutes later, the three of them hurried toward the elevator. The building remained eerily silent. As the elevator doors closed, TAEHYUNG glanced back down the empty hallway. For just a fraction of a second, he thought he saw someone standing at the far end near the emergency exit. The figure disappeared before he could look again. The elevator descended in complete silence. None of them spoke during the drive back to the hospital either. Every passing streetlight only increased the feeling that they were being watched. When they finally reached the hospital entrance, they immediately noticed something was wrong. Several police officers stood near the emergency department speaking with hospital staff. RM frowned. Why are the police here? They hurried inside. J-Hope was packing anxiously across the waiting area while Jin sat with his head lowered, his hands clasped together. JIMIN stood near the nurse's station, speaking urgently with one of the doctors. The moment he saw the others return, he rushed toward them. Where were you? RM answered quickly. What happened? JIMIN's face had completely lost its color. Someone entered Jungkook's room. The words struck all three of them instantly. SUGA stepped forward. What? JIMIN took a deep breath. About 20 minutes after you left, one of the nurses noticed someone wearing a hospital mask coming out of Jungkook's room. At first, nobody thought anything was unusual because they assumed it was another doctor. Jin continued the explanation. But when the actual doctor came back a few minutes later, they realized nobody had authorized another visit. RM looked toward the intensive care unit. Was Jungkook hurt? The doctor who had been speaking with JIMIN approached them immediately. Fortunately, no. Relief briefly crossed their faces before the doctor added, but whoever entered his room left something. He handed RM a sealed evidence bag. Inside was a folded piece of white paper. RM carefully opened it. It was only one handwritten sentence. Stop looking backward if you want him to have a future. The handwriting wasn't Jungkook's. It wasn't any members. SUGA quietly looked toward TAEHYUNG. The timing matched the anonymous messages perfectly. Whoever had been following Jungkook had now entered his hospital room while he lay unconscious. The realization sent a wave of anger through every member. J-Hope clenched his fists. How does someone just walk into intensive care? The doctor shook his head. We're reviewing every security camera in the hospital. TAEHYUNG suddenly remembered the man in the baseball cap standing at the end of the corridor earlier that night. Without another word, he pulled Jungkook's hidden photograph from his backpack and handed it to the doctor. Look at this man. The doctor studied the image carefully. His expression changed almost immediately. I've seen this person before. Every member froze. RM stepped closer. Where? The doctor looked toward the intensive care unit before answering in a voice barely above a whisper. He wasn't here tonight for the first time. He visited this hospital nearly 2 months ago, asking specifically about Jungkook. The doctor's words seemed to drain every remaining bit of warmth from the hospital hallway. Nobody spoke. The idea that the mysterious man had already been inside this hospital 2 months earlier completely changed everything they thought they knew. RM stared at the doctor, searching his face for any sign of uncertainty. There was none. Are you absolutely sure? RM asked quietly. The doctor nodded without hesitation. I remember him because his behavior felt unusual. SUGA stepped closer. What exactly did he ask? The doctor folded his arms as he tried to remember every detail. He came to the information desk and introduced himself as someone concerned about a close friend. He didn't give his name. But he specifically asked whether Jungkook had recently visited our hospital. JIMIN immediately looked down. Jungkook had never mentioned that anyone might have been looking for him here. The doctor continued. When we explained that we couldn't discuss patient information, he smiled politely, thanked us, and left without causing any trouble. Jin frowned. That's all. The doctor slowly shook his head. No. His expression became more serious. About 10 minutes later, one of our security guards reported seeing the same man standing outside the staff entrance watching the building. When the guard approached him, he simply walked away. TAEHYUNG instinctively reached into his pocket and touched the folded letter Jungkook had written. Every new piece of information matched what Jungkook had been secretly documenting for months. RM asked the question everyone was thinking. Why didn't anyone report this earlier? The doctor sighed quietly. Because at the time, we had no reason to believe it was connected to anything serious. SUGA clenched his jaw. Now we do. One of the police officers approached the group carrying a tablet. We've started reviewing the hospital cameras. He looked toward the doctor. Would you mind confirming whether this is the person you saw? The tablet displayed a still image taken from a hallway security camera only 40 minutes earlier. The figure wore a medical mask and dark clothing, making identification difficult. The doctor studied it carefully before nodding. Yes. Everyone leaned closer to the screen. The baseball cap was gone, but the scratched black leather watch remained clearly visible on the person's left wrist. TAEHYUNG immediately recognized it. It's him. The police officer zoomed in further. The man's face remained mostly hidden, but another detail suddenly became visible. Around his neck hung a staff identification badge turned backward so that no name could be seen. J-Hope frowned. He disguised himself as hospital staff. The officer nodded, which means he planned this. RM quietly looked at the evidence bag containing the handwritten note left beside Jungkook's bed. He's trying to scare us away from something. TAEHYUNG immediately thought about the laptop, the hidden compartment, and the USB drive now inside his backpack. The anonymous messages had repeatedly warned them to stop looking. That meant whatever Jungkook had hidden was probably far more important than they realized. Before anyone could continue the discussion, another nurse hurried toward the group. She looked directly at the doctor. "Excuse me," her voice was urgent. "The patient is awake." Every member turned at once. JIMIN's eyes immediately filled with hope. The doctor nodded quickly. "Only one person can enter for now." Nobody moved. For a brief moment, each member silently hoped someone else would make the decision. Then JIMIN quietly stepped backward. TAEHYUNG should go. Everyone looked at him in surprise. JIMIN forced a weak smile despite the exhaustion on his face. He asked for TAEHYUNG before. TAEHYUNG hesitated. "Are you sure?" JIMIN nodded. "If he trusted you with something, then maybe there's a reason." SUGA quietly placed one hand on TAEHYUNG's shoulder. "Go." TAEHYUNG slowly followed the doctor into the intensive care unit. This time the room felt different. The emergency alarms had stopped. The lights seemed softer. Jungkook's eyes were open, though they remained unfocused from exhaustion. His breathing was still assisted by oxygen, and several monitors continued tracking every heartbeat. TAEHYUNG carefully approached the bed. Jungkook slowly turned his head. The moment he recognized TAEHYUNG, a faint smile appeared despite the obvious pain in his expression. He tried to speak, but his voice was too weak. TAEHYUNG leaned closer. "Don't force yourself." Jungkook slowly lifted one trembling hand. TAEHYUNG immediately held it. Jungkook closed his eyes briefly before whispering only 3 words. "The USB first." TAEHYUNG frowned. "The USB drive?" Jungkook gave the smallest possible nod. "Don't trust." His voice faded before he could finish. TAEHYUNG leaned even closer. "Don't trust who?" Jungkook struggled to breathe. Tried again, forcing the words out with visible effort. "Don't trust." Suddenly the heart monitor began accelerating again. Nurses rushed toward the bed. The doctor immediately motioned for TAEHYUNG to step back. Jungkook weakly tightened his grip on TAEHYUNG's hand one final time before losing consciousness once more. The last word never came. TAEHYUNG stood frozen as the medical team worked around him. His mind replayed the unfinished sentence again and again. "Don't trust the." The doctor gently guided him out of the room. Waiting outside, the other members immediately stood. RM looked directly at him. What did he say? TAEHYUNG slowly reached into his backpack and removed the USB drive Jungkook had hidden inside the secret compartment. His hands trembled as he looked at the others. He said, "This comes first." None of them realized that, at that exact moment, the mysterious man who had been following Jungkook for months was sitting alone inside a parked car across the street from the hospital, quietly watching the intensive care windows while smiling at a second identical USB drive resting in the palm of his hand. The silence surrounding the small USB drive felt heavier than anything the members had experienced that night. TAEHYUNG held it carefully in his hand, almost afraid to move. Jungkook had struggled through pain just to say 3 words. The USB first. Whatever was stored inside had become more important than unfinished conversations, more important than unanswered questions, perhaps even more important than discovering the identity of the man who had been following him. RM looked around the hallway before making a decision. Not here. SUGA immediately understood. Too many people. Jin quietly nodded. Hospital staff, police officers, visitors, and security cameras surrounded them. If someone had already managed to enter Jungkook's room disguised as hospital personnel, there was no reason to believe the hallway was safe. J-Hope suggested using one of the private family consultation rooms on the floor below. The doctor quickly arranged access, reminding them that Jungkook would continue resting under close observation. Minutes later, the 6 members entered the small consultation room together. RM carefully locked the door from the inside before placing a hospital laptop on the table. TAEHYUNG slowly inserted the USB drive into the computer. For a brief second, nothing happened. Then a single folder appeared automatically on the desktop. Its name consisted of only one sentence. Please finish watching before judging anyone. Nobody spoke. RM clicked the folder. Inside were 5 video recordings numbered in order. The first file automatically began playing. The screen showed Jungkook sitting alone inside what appeared to be a hotel room several weeks earlier. He looked healthier than he did now, but there was obvious exhaustion behind his eyes. He took a deep breath before looking directly into the camera. If you're watching this, then I probably wasn't able to explain everything myself. His familiar voice instantly filled the quiet room. Before anyone says anything, JIMIN is innocent. JIMIN immediately lowered his head. Jungkook continued. He kept my promise because I asked him to. If I had told any of you, you would have stopped every schedule, cancelled every plan, and blamed yourselves. I couldn't let that happen. SUGA quietly looked toward JIMIN. Some of the guilt that had weighed on both of them throughout the night slowly began to ease, though it didn't disappear. Jungkook smiled sadly at the camera. I've always been the youngest. You spent years protecting me. I just wanted one chance to protect all of you instead. Jin wiped tears from his face before looking away. The video continued. But that's not why I recorded this. Jungkook reached beside him and picked up several printed photographs. He held them toward the camera one by one. They were clearer versions of the surveillance images they had already found. The mysterious man appeared outside clinics, rehearsal studios, parking garages, and even airports. This person isn't following me because of my health. Jungkook's expression became noticeably more serious. He's looking for something I accidentally found. RM leaned closer to the screen. Jungkook continued. About 7 months ago, after a late-night rehearsal, I stayed behind because I forgot my headphones. When I came back to the hallway, I saw someone copying files from one of the company computers onto a portable drive. Every member exchanged confused glances. Jungkook lowered his voice. The person never saw me. I left without saying anything because I thought it was probably authorized. He paused briefly before continuing. A week later, anonymous messages started arriving. SUGA frowned. So it started after that night. Jungkook nodded inside the recording, almost as though he had heard him. At first, they only warned me to forget what I had seen. Then they started mentioning my medical appointments. That's when I realized whoever sent them knew far more about my life than they should. TAEHYUNG remembered the notebook hidden inside the locker. Everything matched perfectly. Jungkook looked away from the camera for several seconds before returning his eyes to the lens. I never told the company because I wasn't sure what I had actually witnessed. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe I misunderstood everything. But then people started following me. The recording briefly cut to several short clips taken secretly with Jungkook's phone, each showing the same mysterious man appearing in different locations. Then the video returned to Jungkook speaking directly to the camera. There's one more thing you deserve to know. His expression softened. I don't think the person following me is the real problem. Every member immediately became still. Jungkook took another slow breath. I think he's working for someone else. The room fell silent except for the sound of the laptop speakers. RM unconsciously leaned forward. JIMIN forgot to breathe. Jin clasped his hands together. J-Hope stared without blinking. SUGA's eyes narrowed. TAEHYUNG felt another wave of dread. Jungkook slowly reached toward the camera and held up a folded piece of paper. I wrote down the name I suspect. Before he could unfold it, the video suddenly froze. The image remained stuck for several seconds before a black screen appeared. Then unfamiliar white text filled the monitor. File COUPTD. RM immediately tried reopening the recording. The same message appeared again. SUGA checked the remaining video files. One after another, every file beyond the first displayed the exact same error. The rest of Jungkook's message had been erased. TAEHYUNG stared at the screen in disbelief. That's impossible. RM quickly examined the USB contents. Someone modified these files. J-Hope looked toward the others. You mean before Jungkook hid the USB? SUGA slowly shook his head. Or after? At that exact moment, TAEHYUNG's phone vibrated for the third time that night. He already knew it would be another anonymous message before he even looked. He opened it anyway. There were only 2 sentences. You're finally asking the right questions. Now compare your USB with mine. Every member slowly turned toward TAEHYUNG as the horrifying realization settled over the room. Somewhere outside the hospital, the mysterious man wasn't afraid that they had discovered Jungkook's evidence. He wanted them to discover it. The consultation room fell into complete silence after TAEHYUNG read the anonymous message aloud. No one reached for the laptop. No one spoke. Every member was trying to understand the same terrifying possibility. If the mysterious man possessed an identical USB drive, then everything they had just watched might have been carefully planned from the very beginning. RM slowly closed the laptop and rested both hands on the table. His calm expression remained, but everyone could see the exhaustion behind his eyes. We've been reacting to every move. His voice was quiet. What if that's exactly what he wants? SUGA nodded slowly. Every anonymous message has pushed us toward a specific decision. J-Hope leaned back in his chair. The rooftop, the locker, the hospital, every clue. Jin looked toward TAEHYUNG. Even the message telling you to go alone. TAEHYUNG quietly clenched his fists. The realization made him feel sick. They hadn't been solving a mystery. They had been following a trail that someone else seemed to understand long before they did. JIMIN remained unusually silent. Throughout the entire discussion, his eyes never left the paused image of Jungkook on the laptop screen. There was something about Jungkook's expression during the recording that continued bothering him. It wasn't fear. It wasn't panic. It was determination. As though Jungkook had expected the evidence to be tampered with. Suddenly, JIMIN stood up. Everyone looked at him. Play it again. RM frowned. The video. The first one. RM reopened the recording from the beginning. Jungkook appeared on the screen once more, sitting quietly inside the hotel room. This time, JIMIN ignored the words. Instead, he carefully watched everything surrounding Jungkook. The table beside him, the curtains, the notebook resting near his elbow, every tiny movement. Then he suddenly raised his hand. Stop. RM paused the video. What is it? JIMIN pointed toward the reflection in the hotel window behind Jungkook. At first, nobody noticed anything unusual. Then TAEHYUNG leaned closer. Reflected faintly in the glass was the edge of a television screen mounted on the opposite wall. On that television appeared a paused digital clock displaying a date and time. JIMIN's eyes widened. That recording wasn't made several weeks ago. RM looked again. The date on the reflection matched only 4 days before Jungkook collapsed. SUGA immediately understood. He wanted us to believe he recorded it earlier. Jin looked confused. Why would he do that? JIMIN slowly answered. Because by then, he already knew someone might get the USB. The room became silent again. Suddenly, the missing videos seemed less like a mistake and more like part of a backup plan. Jungkook had expected the files to be altered. He had expected someone to intercept the evidence. RM reopened the folder and carefully searched through every hidden file instead of only the visible videos. Several ordinary system folders appeared. Most were empty. Then one folder with no name caught his attention. It contained only a single image file. He opened it. The photograph showed an ordinary hotel desk with scattered papers. Nothing unusual. SUGA frowned. That's it. TAEHYUNG looked closer. Wait. On the corner of the desk sat a folded napkin with handwritten numbers partially visible beneath a coffee cup. JIMIN suddenly remembered. Zoom in. RM enlarged the image. The handwriting became clearer. It wasn't random numbers. They formed a storage locker code followed by the name of a small train station on the outskirts of Seoul. Every member looked at one another. Jin whispered, he hid something else. Before anyone could respond, someone knocked gently on the consultation room door. Every head immediately turned. RM slowly approached the entrance without speaking. Who is it? A familiar voice answered from outside. It's the doctor. RM opened the door cautiously. The doctor stood there alone, looking slightly out of breath. I'm sorry to interrupt, he said quietly. Jungkook woke up again. Hope immediately flashed across every face. Can we see him? JIMIN asked. The doctor hesitated. There's something unusual. RM's expression tightened. What happened? The doctor looked down for a brief moment before answering. He only regained consciousness for less than a minute. JIMIN stepped closer. Did he say anything? The doctor nodded slowly. Yes. Another silence settled over the room. He asked whether the storage locker had already been emptied. TAEHYUNG felt his heart stop. Jungkook knew about the second hiding place, the train station, the locker code hidden inside the image. The doctor continued. When I told him I didn't understand what he meant, he became agitated. Jimin's voice trembled. Then what? The doctor looked directly at TAEHYUNG. He said, "Tell TAEHYUNG they're already too late." No one moved. No one even seemed able to breathe. Because if Jungkook believed they were already too late, then whatever had been hidden inside that station locker might no longer be there. And somewhere across the city, the mysterious man who claimed to possess the second USB drive was almost certainly heading toward the exact same destination. The doctor's final words continued echoing through the consultation room long after he had left. "Tell TAEHYUNG they're already too late." Nobody spoke for several seconds because nobody wanted to accept what those words might mean. TAEHYUNG slowly lowered himself into the nearest chair, staring blankly at the storage locker code still displayed on the laptop screen. Jungkook had hidden another clue, another backup, another piece of evidence, yet somehow he already believed it had been compromised. RM quietly walked to the window overlooking the dark hospital parking lot. Rain continued falling across the city, turning the streetlights into blurred reflections. "We still don't know if the locker has actually been emptied," he said calmly. SUGA folded his arms. "Then we verify it." J-Hope looked toward the clock on the wall. It was already well past midnight. "If someone else is heading there." He didn't finish the sentence. Everyone understood. Time had become their greatest enemy. Jin looked toward Jimin. "You should stay here with Jungkook." Jimin immediately shook his head. "No." His answer came without hesitation. "I've stayed behind every time because I thought protecting his secret was enough. I'm not making that mistake again." His voice carried a quiet determination none of them had heard all night. RM watched him carefully before nodding once. "Then we all go together." SUGA immediately disagreed. "No." Every member turned toward him. "If Jungkook wakes up again, someone he trusts has to be here." Silence followed. SUGA slowly looked at Jimin. "He'll look for you first." Jimin's shoulders dropped. Deep down, he knew SUGA was right. If Jungkook regained consciousness again and found everyone gone, the guilt would only become worse. After several long moments, Jimin reluctantly nodded. "I'll stay." TAEHYUNG stepped closer and placed the small silver key into Jimin's hand. "Keep this." Jimin frowned. "Why?" TAEHYUNG smiled faintly. "Because Jungkook trusted you first." The gesture carried more meaning than words ever could. The misunderstanding that had divided them only hours earlier quietly began to disappear. Jimin closed his fingers around the key and nodded silently. Less than 20 minutes later, RM, SUGA, Jin, J-Hope, and TAEHYUNG drove through the rain toward the small train station listed inside Jungkook's hidden photograph. None of them spoke during the drive. The station was nearly empty when they arrived. Only a handful of late-night commuters remained inside the quiet building. TAEHYUNG quickly found the row of rental storage lockers near the back wall. He compared the handwritten code from the image with the locker numbers. There it was. Locker 317. His pulse quickened. RM stepped beside him. "Open it." TAEHYUNG carefully entered the combination exactly as it appeared in the photograph. The electronic lock flashed green. A soft click echoed through the hallway. Slowly he pulled the locker door open. Inside sat a single plain cardboard box, untouched. Every member quietly let out the breath they had been holding. "We're not too late," Jin whispered. SUGA carefully removed the box and placed it on a nearby bench. There was no lock, no tape, only another handwritten note resting on top. RM picked it up first. The note contained only one sentence. "If this box is still here, then I guessed wrong, and I'll be happier than you'll ever know." The members exchanged confused glances. TAEHYUNG slowly lifted the lid. Inside were several old photo albums, a portable recorder, a sealed envelope, and something wrapped carefully in a dark blue scarf. Jin gently unfolded the scarf. Hidden inside was the original memory card from a tiny action camera. RM frowned. "Not another USB." SUGA smiled weakly for the first time that night. Smarter. Unlike the corrupted USB files, a removable memory card would have been much harder for someone to alter without replacing it completely. TAEHYUNG picked up the small portable recorder. A sticky note attached to it read, "Listen first." He pressed the play button. After a brief burst of static, Jungkook's voice filled the quiet station. "If you're hearing this, then at least one of my backup plans worked." Every member instinctively moved closer. Jungkook sounded tired, but his voice remained steady. "I know by now you've probably found the USB. If the videos after the first one don't work, that means someone accessed it before you." RM slowly closed his eyes. Jungkook had predicted everything. The recording continued. The person following me isn't trying to hide the truth anymore. They're trying to control which truth you believe. SUGA looked toward TAEHYUNG. Exactly what RM said. Jungkook took another slow breath on the recording. That's why I separated the evidence. The members listened without making a sound. Inside this box is everything I couldn't trust to one place, but before you open the envelope, his voice softened noticeably, there's something I need to say. Several seconds of silence passed on the recording. Then Jungkook quietly laughed to himself. You know, I spent months thinking I was protecting everyone else. Maybe I was just afraid of seeing disappointment in your faces. J-Hope lowered his head. Jungkook continued, if I don't get the chance to say this in person, thank you. Tears immediately formed in Jin's eyes. Every memory we made together was worth every difficult day, every rehearsal, every argument, every concert. Every late-night conversation. If I had another chance, I'd choose the same family all over again. None of the members realized they were crying until the tears were already falling. Then Jungkook's tone suddenly changed. It became serious again. Now open the envelope. TAEHYUNG carefully picked up the sealed envelope from inside the box. Across the front, written neatly in black ink, were 8 words that instantly made every heartbeat stop. The person you suspect is completely innocent. For several long seconds, nobody touched the envelope. The 8 handwritten words across the front seemed to erase every conclusion they had reached during the longest night of their lives. The person you suspect is completely innocent. RM slowly looked around at the others. None of them admitted it aloud, but each had silently begun building their own theories. Every anonymous message, every hidden clue, every unexplained coincidence had pushed them toward doubting someone, even if they desperately didn't want to. Jungkook had known that would happen. Somehow, he had predicted that fear would slowly turn trust into suspicion. TAEHYUNG carefully broke the seal. Inside was a single folded letter and several printed documents clipped neatly together. He unfolded the first page while the others gathered around him. Jungkook's familiar handwriting immediately filled the page. If you're reading this, then I was right about one thing. The clues I left probably made you suspicious of each other. I'm sorry, that was never my intention. TAEHYUNG quietly swallowed before continuing. I left incomplete evidence because I believed someone was copying or changing anything I stored digitally. I couldn't risk writing one complete explanation in one place. SUGA slowly nodded. That's why every hiding place only had part of the story. Jungkook continued. If you've started wondering whether one of our members betrayed me, stop. None of them did. Every member silently closed their eyes for a moment. The unbearable weight that had quietly settled between them throughout the night finally began to lift. Jin wiped away another tear. J-Hope let out the first steady breath he had taken in hours. RM rested one hand against the table, relief mixing with lingering confusion. TAEHYUNG continued reading. The silver bracelet, the anonymous messages, the photographs, even the hospital visits. They were all meant to make you doubt the people closest to you. That's how manipulation works. If you stop trusting your family, you become easier to control. JIMIN wasn't there to hear those words, yet every member wished he could. They all remembered the pain in his face when the secrets first came to light. Jungkook had understood from the very beginning exactly how dangerous suspicion could become. TAEHYUNG turned to the next page. Attached beneath it were printed copies of visitor records from several hospitals, security logs from different buildings, and appointment schedules marked with handwritten notes. RM carefully examined them. A pattern slowly emerged. Every location where Jungkook believed he was being followed shared one unexpected connection. The same private medical transportation company appeared repeatedly in the records. Jin frowned. Why would the same company show up everywhere? SUGA studied the documents more closely because several hospitals used the same transportation contractor. RM looked toward the company name printed at the top of each page. That means. Before he finished, TAEHYUNG quietly reached the final paragraph of Jungkook's letter. His voice slowed. I don't think the man following me chose me personally. I think he was watching everyone connected to the investigation. The room became silent again. Jungkook continued. One doctor quietly warned me that another patient had reported being followed after requesting copies of confidential records. At first I thought it was unrelated. Then I started seeing the same man. RM carefully reread the hospital documents. Suddenly, the story shifted again. Perhaps Jungkook had accidentally crossed paths with something much larger than himself, not because he was a celebrity, not because he was Jungkook, but because he had unknowingly noticed something someone else desperately wanted hidden. TAEHYUNG unfolded the last page. There was only one final message. If I wake up, burn everything after the truth is safely in the hands of people who can actually investigate it. Don't spend your lives chasing shadows the way I did. Nobody spoke. The room remained completely still until Jin quietly asked, "Should we call the police?" RM looked at the evidence spread across the table. "Not yet." SUGA looked surprised. RM calmly explained, "Not because I don't trust them. Because Jungkook clearly wanted us to understand the full picture before handing anything over." Everyone slowly nodded. The recording device suddenly clicked by itself. They had assumed it had already finished, but another short message began playing automatically. Jungkook laughed softly. "If this part is playing, then I almost forgot one last thing." The members immediately looked toward the recorder again. "TAEHYUNG," his voice became unusually gentle. "Stop blaming yourself for agreeing to keep my last promise." TAEHYUNG's eyes widened. Jungkook continued, "JIMIN wasn't the only one carrying my secrets. You both were. I just asked you to protect different things." TAEHYUNG quietly lowered his head. "One of you protected the truth. The other protected the family. Neither of you failed me." Tears rolled silently down TAEHYUNG's face. The guilt he had been carrying since opening the second letter finally began to break apart. Then Jungkook added one sentence none of them expected. "If you're listening together, that means I was lucky enough to have all of you beside me until the end." The recording ended with a soft click. Before anyone could speak, every light inside the station suddenly flickered once, then twice. A station employee hurried across the waiting area, speaking urgently into a radio. Moments later, an emergency announcement echoed through the nearly empty building, causing every member to look toward the entrance. Outside, several police vehicles had just arrived, surrounding the station from every direction as officers rushed toward the storage locker area, carrying photographs of a man wearing a familiar black leather watch with a deep scratch across the strap. The emergency announcement continued echoing through the nearly empty station as uniformed officers spread across every entrance. RM quietly gathered Jungkook's documents while SUGA slipped the recorder and memory card back into the cardboard box. None of them wanted the evidence left exposed in the middle of the station. A senior police investigator approached them with several officers following behind. He held a folder filled with photographs and stopped only a few steps away. "I'm sorry to interrupt," he said calmly. "Were you the people who opened locker 317? RM nodded cautiously. "Yes." The investigator looked briefly at the box resting on the bench before returning his attention to RM. "Then I believe we're looking for the same person." Every member exchanged confused glances. The investigator slowly opened his folder and removed a printed photograph. It showed the same mysterious man wearing the scratched black leather watch and dark baseball cap. This time, however, his face was completely visible. TAEHYUNG immediately recognized him. "That's the man from the hospital." The investigator nodded. "His name isn't important right now because it changes often. He's used several false identities over the past few years." Jin frowned. "Who is he?" The investigator took a slow breath. "He's not connected to your group." Relief briefly crossed their faces before he continued. "He's connected to an ongoing investigation involving stolen medical information and unauthorized access to confidential patient records across several hospitals." SUGA looked down at Jungkook's documents. Everything suddenly began fitting together. The investigator continued. "Several months ago, one of our witnesses disappeared after reporting suspicious activity involving patient files. Since then, we've been trying to identify everyone who might have unknowingly crossed paths with the same people." RM quietly asked, "You think Jungkook became involved by accident?" The investigator nodded. "Based on what we've gathered so far, yes." TAEHYUNG remembered Jungkook's words from the recorder. "I don't think he chose me personally." Jungkook had been right. The investigator looked toward the cardboard box. "May I ask what's inside?" RM hesitated only briefly before answering. "Evidence." Jungkook collected himself. The investigator's expression softened. "Then he may have helped more people than he ever realized." Silence settled over the group again. For the first time since that terrible night began, the mystery no longer felt like something pulling the members apart. Instead, it revealed how desperately Jungkook had been trying to protect everyone around him, even while carrying fear and uncertainty alone. The investigator carefully accepted copies of the documents and memory card, promising that every piece of evidence would be examined properly. Before leaving, he looked directly at RM. "Your friend showed remarkable courage." RM quietly smiled despite the tears still visible in his eyes. "He'd probably tell you he was just being stubborn." The investigator returned the smile before walking away with his team. Outside, the rain had finally begun to slow. The members stood together beneath the station entrance for several minutes without speaking. Nobody felt the need to. The silence between them no longer carried suspicion. It carried understanding. RM finally looked toward the others. "Let's go back." No one asked where. They all already knew. When they returned to the hospital, the first light of dawn was beginning to appear beyond the city skyline. JIMIN was still sitting outside Jungkook's room exactly where they had left him. His eyes immediately searched their faces the moment they stepped off the elevator. He stood quickly. "What happened?" TAEHYUNG walked directly toward him and placed the small silver key back into JIMIN's hand. He was telling the truth. JIMIN looked confused. "About what?" SUGA answered quietly. "About everything." Jin gently wrapped one arm around JIMIN's shoulders. "No one betrayed him." The words hit JIMIN harder than anyone expected. He closed his eyes as tears quietly rolled down his face. Months of guilt, fear, and uncertainty finally began falling away. RM looked through the small window into Jungkook's room. Jungkook remained asleep, but his breathing had become calmer than at any point during the night. The doctor approached them with a tired smile. "His condition is stable." Every member quietly lowered their heads in relief. It wasn't a guarantee, it wasn't a perfect ending, but it was hope. They entered the room together one by one, standing around Jungkook's bed exactly as they had done countless times throughout their lives whenever one of them needed the others. Nobody spoke loudly, nobody cried anymore. JIMIN gently took Jungkook's hand and smiled through tears. "You carried enough by yourself." His voice was barely a whisper. "When you wake up, we're carrying the rest together." The morning sunlight slowly spread across the hospital room, touching each member standing quietly beside the youngest brother they had almost lost. For the first time since the nightmare began, they no longer feared the secrets waiting behind them. They only waited for the moment Jungkook would finally open his eyes and discover that, despite everything that had happened, his family was still exactly where he had left them. And just as the first rays of sunlight reached Jungkook's face, one of his fingers moved ever so slightly, leaving only one unanswered question hanging over everyone in the room. What was the very first truth he would choose to tell after waking up?